We will use Solver to optimize the Hot Springs Spas problem that is in front of you. So what are the steps? The steps to use Solver are, first, you figure out what is your objective. Then you figure out what are the changing cells. And lastly, you figure out what are the constraints. Now remember, Solver is an optimization tool that is located in Excel. So the first thing that you would want to do is you would want to set up your spreadsheet like the screenshot that you see right here. So you take a blank worksheet and you type in the things that you see in front of you. So type in the title, center it, bold it, type in the column headings here, type in the constraints, type in everything you see. Now, once you have set up your model, you also know that you're going to need to use Solver based on the scenario that you see in front of you. It tells you in the instructions, given the constraints above, use Solver to assist Deborah in her what-if analysis. Deborah has provided you with a screenshot of a template you can use. So this is the template that you see right here. This is what you need to put onto a blank worksheet. You would be expected to set it up, format it, and make it look just like the one that you see. Now, the next step would be to go to File, go to Options, go to Add-ins, and then go to the bottom where it says Excel Add-ins and click Go, and make sure that you have the Solver add-in box checked, because this is what makes available under Data. You will see on the right-hand side a button called Solver. Now, before we start analyzing the paragraph that you see in front of you, I want to look at the Solver so that for those who do not remember it or have not seen it, you know what you're going to be working with. This is Solver, and this tool, this dialog box, will allow you to enter data, and then when you've entered what you need to, then you can solve, and it will actually take your model here and give you an answer. So you will be able to answer the question that is in the scenario. All right, so how do we figure things out? Well, we read the paragraph. So Hot Spring Spas manufactures and sells 2 spa models, Steamboat and Classic. So you can see you have Steamboat and Classic. Hot Spring Spas receives spa bodies from other manufacturers and then adds a pump tubing to circulate the water. The Steamboat model demands 15.5 hours of labor and 14.5 feet of tubing. Well, you can see that. You've got 15.5 right here by labor, 14.5 by your piping right here, which is the tubing, right? The Classic model does 10.5 and uses 20 feet of tubing, and that is what you see under Classic. And the 1 means that you need 1 for each Steamboat or Classic. All right, now, based on selling patterns, the owner, Deborah Leeson, has determined that the Steamboat model generates a profit of $400 a unit, and each Classic model generates $345 of profit. So you can see that profit per unit, 400, and the classic profit is 345. So that's that sentence. So the information that we've talked about so far is information that is put into this model so that you can use it to find the optimal quantity to produce. All right. Now, Deborah does say that she would like a large labor capacity and sufficient tubing and motors to build any number of spas, but her resources are limited. For the next production period, she has 2,650 labor hours, 3,450 feet of tubing, and 231 pumps available. And these are the numbers that you see under available. We now have talked about in this area here. So again, if you go for the first and largest part of what you've just read, all the way down to 231 pumps available, this is the information that you see on your screen already. So the last thing that we need to read and to be able to actually then solve with our solver tool is Deborah needs assistance in figuring out how many steamboats and classic models to build in order to maximize her profit. So let's look at that sentence. What does it mean? It says she needs to figure out how many steamboats and classic models to build in order to maximize her profit. So quantity to produce. She needs to know the answer to that. That's what she says. How many models to build, quantity to produce. That these two cells right here, C4, D4, are what she's trying to figure out. Her objective then is to maximize her profit. Well, you see total profit, which is right here. Okay, so quantity to produce and maximize her profit, right? That's her objective. And her changing cells. Right. Now, given the constraints, use solver to assist Deborah in the what if. So what does that mean? Given the constraints. Well, the constraints are what is available. You cannot use more than what you have. If you only have X amount of labor available, that's all you can do. You can't use more. All right, so that is what's called a constraint. All right, so again, what is the objective? The objective is right here, to maximize the profit. So total profit, cell D7, that is where the total profit is. And what we're trying to do is maximize that profit by changing the quantity to produce, which is your C4 and D4, okay, by not going over the constraints that we have, which are these numbers right under available, the three of them right there in D15 through 17. All right, now that we've figured out what our objective is, what our changing cells are, and what are our constraints, we have one other thing to do before we solve. We have some calculations, Excel calculations that we need to create. First of all, to get the total profit, you have to have a calculation to be able to figure that out. What do you do to get the total profit? Well, you would need to figure that out, and you would do that by thinking about what is profit. Well, you can see she already gave you a profit per unit. So I know that every time I make a steamboat, I'm going to make $400. So if I want to know my total profit, then I can multiply the profit and by the quantity for the steamboat, and then add the classic quantity times the profit, and that would give me my calculation. So I am multiplying and adding in this calculation. I multiply the quantity times the profit for the steamboat. I multiply the quantity to produce of the classic by the profit and add those two together, and this will give me my total profit. That formula needs to be in cell D7. Then I need another calculation. The calculation would be under the allocated. To figure that up, I have to do a formula. So my first formula would be in C15, cell C15 for labor. How do I figure out what that calculation is? I look at the things available to me, and then I create a calculation to be able to figure out what is allocated. So, for example, for labor, I would need to know the steamboat labor, and I know that by looking at cell C10. C10 is the amount of labor it takes to build a steamboat, 15.5. I would multiply that number by the quantity. I need to do the exact same thing for the classic. And then I would add the two together. So these three calculations are multiplication and addition. And I do that one more time by multiplying the labor. Okay, so I put in this cell C15, my formula that would multiply the labor times the quantity for each, the steamboat first, your classic, and then you have to add those two together. After I finish the labor one, I would do the next one down, which is my C16. I would do the exact same type of formula, but do it for piping. And then I do the exact same type of formula for pumps. These 4 calculations that you will need to do are all multiplication and addition formulas. Once I have completed those formulas, I am ready to solve. I come on the ribbon up here, I click on Solver, and I now fill in the boxes based on what I have figured out, which is, what is the objective? My objective is to maximize my profit. So my objective, this total profit cell, should be in there. I'm maximizing, which you can see it's already set on that, but if it wasn't, I need to click the button. And I am maximizing my profit by changing. So these changing variable cells are the quantity to produce and for both the steamboat and the classic. So this range should be your changing cells. Subject to the constraints, you will need to add your constraints. Okay, we already talked about what you have available is a constraint. Your constraint is you cannot allocate more than you have available. So you must remember that your allocated has to be less than or equal to what is available. You also must use a whole number or an integer. And remember that your quantity cannot be a negative number, so it must be greater than or equal to 0. Those are the 3 constraints that you need to put into this box. You will add a constraint by clicking on Add and then creating those constraints in here. You will have 3 of them that you need to do that I just went over with you and talked about. So again, you're allocated, meaning these cells right here have to be less than or equal to what you have available. So these cells, this is your cell reference, has to be less than or equal to the constraint, which is what is available. These also, you have to have a quantity to produce that is a whole number. You cannot do a half of a steamboat. You have to do a whole one. So your range is your cell reference, and it would have to be an integer. Right? And lastly, you also cannot have a negative amount of them to produce. So it must be greater than or equal to 0. It cannot be a negative number. So again, the quantity to produce for both the Steamboat and the Classic, and you drop this down, and you change, it must be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, once you have your constraints in, you have added them, you have set your objective, which is total profit, must be maximized by changing the quantity to produce. You are ready to solve. It will solve and put the answer for the quantity to produce in this box, Steamboat and Classic. It will then populate the total profit as well as what can be allocated. And that is a detailed description and assistance for completing this project. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email me, and I will be glad to answer any questions that you have.